And good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here as always. Welcome to you, our loyal audience, and a special welcome to our guest tonight, Mr. Ethics and Government himself, Norm Eisen, and the amazing radio journalist and personality, Larry Mantle. Thank you both for joining us to cover a wide array of current events. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. And I want to thank our leadership team, including former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lear, and me. I'm also on the leadership team. Next week, we continue our conversation about risks to our democracy as we welcome former acting Solicitor General of the United States, the brilliant Neil Katyal, and Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist Carol Leonig in conversation with Pat Morrison. The following week, the very dynamic former president of Planned Parenthood, Cecile Richards, who is the daughter of the late Texas Governor Ann Richards, will help us understand the Dobbs effect, how the overturning of Roe versus Wade impacts not only the life and health of America's women, but how it might impact the midterm elections. And whether it's a Jewish or American holiday, I always like to take note during our programs. We are about to celebrate Labor Day. And when we think of Labor Day, we think of barbecues and the approaching end of summer. But the day can also remind us to think about those who labor, to consider their wages and the working conditions, and to remember to honor and acknowledge their work. 1 year near Labor Day, or maybe it was on Yom Kippur, my rabbi, Rabbi Feinstein at Valley Beth Shalom here in Los Angeles, asked our congregation a simple but profound question, which has stayed with me for decades. And the question was, who do you think made those tennis shoes that you were excited to buy for $10? How old do you think she is, and how much do you think she earns? So Labor Day is a very good time to remember to be fair in our own employment practices and to be appreciative of those who work for us, both directly and indirectly, and to speak out against child labor and other exploitive labor practices. Thank you all for your donations, large and small. They enable these programs. Now I would like to introduce my friend and colleague in this important enterprise, David Lear. David? Oh, David, we can't hear you. You're muted. So you have to unmute yourself, which I know he'll do. You're not unmuted yet.
Thank you, Janice. There we go. I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion with a longtime friend and former colleague, Norm Eisen. Over 30 years ago, we worked together at the Anti-Defamation League, and he was then, as he is now, committed to decency, speaking the truth, and taking action on his beliefs. Today, he's on a much bigger stage than he was in the 1990s. Janice outlined the next 2 weeks' program. After those, on September 21st, we host Lawrence Tribe, one of Norman's professors, emeritus university professor at Harvard, and a leading maven on how the law actually works and impacts society. He will talk about our precarious times with UC Irvine law professor and former LA Times journalist Henry Weinstein. The following week, September 28th, we host New York University professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a leading scholar on autocracies and their leaders. She'll discuss her recent book, Strongmen: How They Rise, How They Succeed, and How They Fall. She'll be in discussion with Stanford University professor and highly regarded expert in the field of democracy studies, Professor Larry Diamond. I have the pleasure of introducing one of our most frequent hosts, KPC's Larry Mantle. Larry has hosted his station's flagship program, Air Talk, for nearly 40 years. He's an invaluable source of reason and illumination on the Southern California media scene and always probes for meaning and insight, even when he's exploring movies and sports, which is always fun to listen to with Larry. Tonight, the program is all Larry's. Take it away, please, Larry. It's all yours.
David, thank you so much, David, Janice, Zev, Mel. It's always a pleasure to be part of America at a Crossroads, where we deal with these vital issues that are a part of not only our country's struggle right now, but internationally as well. And so the timing is, of course, perfect to hear from the ambassador this evening and to talk with him about how some of these challenges globally interact with what's going on right here in America. Just one point I want to raise for those of you asking questions in the Q&A, please include your location along with your first name, if you will. It's very nice to be able to reference all the different places, just as Janice does at the opening of every one of these, to give a sense of the breadth of viewers from not just across the United States, but literally around the world. Well, our guest this evening has broad expertise that I intend to exploit as much as an hour will allow. Ambassador Norman Eisen is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution and CNN legal analyst. In fact, once he finishes with us tonight, he'll be on CNN on Don Lemon's show. Ambassador Eisen, in addition to those current associations, is co-founder and chair of the States United Democracy Center. His fellow first-year Harvard Law colleague Barack Obama recognized the ambassador's talents and named him deputy counsel of the former president's transition team. From there, the president named him special counsel for ethics and government reform. His final role in the administration was as U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic. The ambassador also served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee for the first Trump impeachment in 2019 into early 2020. Most importantly, he's a fellow graduate of Hollywood High School's alternative school, just like me, go Sheiks. So we have the same alma mater, though the ambassador a couple of years younger than I am, but we shared the same social sciences and history teacher, Judy Coleman, who's watching this evening. Judy, our appreciation to you from all that we learned in high school at Hollywood High. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's start, first of all, with yesterday's late filing in the Trump documents investigation by the Department of Justice claiming that Trump's documents, Trump's team concealed the government documents in an effort to obstruct the FBI's investigation. This followed a request by Trump's team to have a special master appointed to determine if any of the documents were privileged because of attorney-client relationship. And so then today we get the word that the Justice Department is looking at whether there's been obstruction of justice with those around the president, keeping the FBI from being able to take documents that should be in the National Archives. We often hear it's the cover-up that brings people down rather than the original investigation. So, Ambassador, what's the potential for that happening here?
Larry, I think the potential is large that both the cover-up and the alleged crime will lead to one of the sets of charges against very senior people in Donald Trump's circle, possibly including Trump himself. But those won't be the only charges that we see, perhaps as soon as before the end of this year. And with that teaser, I'm going to say, before I launch into the rest of the answer, I'm going to say how pleased I am to be back with all of you. I believe that I helped launch your very inaugural program of Jews United for Democracy and Justice. And we've only become more united as a Jewish people ever since then. I'm sure that's not a coincidence. But the challenges have grown too, and we'll talk about that tonight, including in connection with Larry's question. I must acknowledge my old friend and boss, my second boss, Harvey Schechter. We were reminiscing before the Zoom chart started, the great Harvey Schechter, who David inherited the ADL office and me from Harvey Schechter. I'm not sure which was the greater headache. I may have alone counterbalanced all of David's other service or anxiety. And of course, always great to be back with Janice Resnick. And I see that our friends and our LA leaders, Mel and Zev, are with us, and all of you, all over, not just Southern California, but all over the country. I so enjoyed it when Janice was reading out all the locations.
Yeah.
So
one of my favorite parts of doing these is hearing all those places.
And we salute Hollywood High School. It was my introduction, in some respects, my introduction to politics. I graduated a couple years after Larry, and I was the student body president of Hollywood High School. Larry and I have many friends in common. And I still come to Los Angeles all the time. In fact, I was just there a couple weeks ago. Believe it or not, 10 of us from my high school class are still very close friends, and we all went to Catalina for a 60th birthday celebration.
Very nice. Yeah.
So we were also celebrating, and I did television wearing business on the top, party on the bottom. I was wearing Catalina standard uniform shorts and flip-flops. I did CNN from the beach restaurant in Catalina, because that was right around the time of the search warrant execution, Larry, on Donald Trump's home, Mar-a-Lago. And now, finally, to return to your question, here in these allegations, and let's remember that they are allegations at this point, but they're backed by a lot of evidence, and a court has found probable cause of crimes. That these allegations may be the most likely to stick of any of the federal cases. Of course, I worked on the first impeachment, so we received the Mueller report, Mueller's testimony, worked with Mueller, and I really thought I was signing up for the consequences for Donald Trump. He dodged them. That impeachment ultimately morphed from Mueller's investigation to the Ukraine allegations, and we're going to come back to Ukraine tonight, because I think Putin has taken a page from Trump's book. And now then we've seen the same scandal. It's not multiple scandals, it's one scandal: abuse of power, like when he took these over 200 of our most sensitive secrets. And then with the abuse, these were the two articles in the impeachment I worked on, obstruction. And here in this filing that came this week, Larry, we saw these really startling allegations that documents were moved and hidden and distributed around Mar-a-Lago, and that the Department of Justice thinks obstruction of justice was likely. So I think the crime was bad, but I think the cover-up was bad, and Donald Trump is going to likely pay the price for both.
So, Ambassador, let's talk about some of the specifics here. And, the defenders of the president have said presidents have the right to declassify documents. And if the Justice Department is really going to hang their hat on the idea that these are at the most sensitive levels of secrecy, that they're going to be able to refute that through presidential action. What is required for a president to declassify secret documents?
Well, there is a process, and a president, if they follow the process, Larry, has the power to do that. We saw over and over again during the Trump administration that when the president, despite his disputed powers, did not follow the rule of law, that the courts would throw out his decision making. Here, there are two problems with Donald Trump's assertion that all of these documents were declassified. The first is that, like any other area of the law, there's a set of rules that are in place. I actually, when I was Obama's White House ethics czar, I helped work on the restructuring, the reform. I did anything. I was special counsel for ethics and government reform. I did anything relating to reform except for healthcare reform. One of the big reforms we did, the president issued a new classification system in an executive order that is still in place. That is the same executive order that governs Donald Trump's behavior. In order to comply with the law, the president needs to go through a different set of procedures, depending on the documents. So for some of these most top secret documents that you have here, the president would actually need to notify the agency that he's declassifying them, give the agency an opportunity to explain to him. This doesn't challenge his power, but to explain why that would be a mistake. The markings need to be removed. There needs to be documentation. And that's the second problem with these supposed claims of declassification. It never happened. The president can't get on his social media account now after the fact and say, I declassified them, or one of his supporters has gone on right-wing media to say, well, he automatically declassified whenever he took something up to the residents with him. That's not how it works at all. And it didn't happen here. This is after the fact. It's made up. There's a lot of evidence in this new filing we got. And you know, the cases are morphing even as we speak, Larry, because right before we started talking, I got a silent ping on my phone. Donald Trump just filed his response, and I got a chance to take a very, very quick look at what is in that. So, you know, this is moving so quickly, it's hard to keep up.
Can you give us the gist? I know you may not have had time to delve into it, but could you see what the gist is of his response?
Yes, I could have told you the gist even without reading it, which is that it's full of nonsense. However, I'll be more substantive than that. He makes the following points. First, that when, and I predicted these earlier today, so they don't come as a big surprise, that a president has extraordinary constitutional powers, that is the framework of American governance, and that certain of those powers and prerogatives have to be protected even after the presidency ends for the sake of maintaining the presidency. If you always, he says, if you turn off the powers when the presidency ends, you'll weaken the presidency, because in this case, he says that includes the presidential power over executive privilege. What documents are secret, what not? He says, look, if the government can come to my house and take my papers willy-nilly without any notice, and he has a lot of nasty things to say about the execution of the search warrant, then future presidents will know that they can't get candid advice because their documents are up for grabs. People will censor themselves. People won't write things down. Presidents won't be able to steer the country, and it will hurt the country.
Well, and that
so
isn't
he
that the
argues,
general argument on behalf of executive privilege. That
yes,
is what's involved in that. So he's just extending it post office.
He is. And then he says, therefore, I mean, there's a lot here. It's 20 pages. But then he says, therefore, for that reason, I want to, I want court supervision of this very important matter. The Justice Department is like a totalitarian institution. They want to tell this court, you can't look into it. And he says number three, they distort the law. And in fact, they say the special master doesn't fit here, but this is just why you need a special master. It's even more important. It's the most important special master case ever. And they go on and on from there.
Right.
Now, I have answers to all those points too. And if you ask me, you don't have to ask me right now, Larry.
Well,
but
let me ask you one of them, because we don't have time for all of them. But on the claim that executive privilege and that degree of latitude that an in-office president enjoys should be extended after the president leaves office, what's your response to that claim?
Well, my response is that that issue has been litigated and resolved by the United States. The Supreme Court and the other courts have dealt with this issue, and they have said that there may be some powers as against other people outside the executive branch by a former president. For example, if Congress wants your papers. Now, that issue was just litigated to the Supreme Court with the 1-6 committee. Trump lost, but there might be a future situation. The Supreme Court has left a little daylight, not much. But as to the executive branch itself, it's perfectly clear since the seminal case of Nixon v. GSA that within the executive branch, the current executive branch has the right to look at the documents, to possess the documents. It's also been decided by statute. So Trump is, as he so often has before, taking a principle that doesn't fit in this situation and bending it, twisting it to try to drag it over, but it won't work.
All right, let me ask you also, the supporters of the former president say that what the FBI did was particularly pernicious because the former president is looking at the potential of running again in 2 years, and we've got the midterm elections that are coming up, and that in the FBI taking this action over this issue of National Archives documents, that doesn't rise to the level where the Justice Department should be taking an action that is as extreme as searching a former president's residence. Your response to this, given the context of the midterms and the potential of the former president to run again?
Well, my response is simple, and it was the motto of our impeachment. In America, no one is above the law. The whole idea that this country is founded on was to reject the British monarchy, where you had a king, you had one person who was above the law, who was the law. When you violate, allegedly violate, with as much evidence as we have here, first you take the documents, then there's negotiations for a year, and 15 boxes are sent back, and they're full of highly classified documents. Then the government negotiates for months more, and an additional grouping of dozens of classified documents are sent back in response to a subpoena, Larry. And there's a certification by Trump's lawyers. That's all the classified. And then informants tell you, and that's clear from the filing last night, there are multiple informants. Then you have informants who say, oh no, there's dozens and dozens more of these documents left at Mar-a-Lago. And in fact, they've been moved around to try to hide what's going on. A search warrant is legitimate. Anybody else in America, if you or I had done a tiny fraction of this, we would have been charged long ago. The president has already benefited from special treatment. Not he, and no one is entitled to that much special treatment. Not on the document crimes. We can talk about what those alleged crimes are, and not on the alleged obstruction of justice. That's my answer. It's contrary to the very idea of America, our Constitution, and our rule of law.
So, Ambassador, how does this then factor into what we're seeing around the world? Because you contend that it's part of a larger anti-democratic movement, Putin's invasion of Ukraine with the Russian military, what we see in other countries with the rise of authoritarian regimes. How does this interconnect with what's happening here?
My first book, which my Jews United for Democracy and Justice event was about this book, The Last Palace, was the story of the American and European century, the transatlantic century. Woodrow Wilson's entry into World War I transformed the relationship between the US and Europe. And then we've had a century of ups and downs. And the overriding lesson of that past century, Larry, is that, you know how they say all politics is local? Well, I have a different saying. All democracy is international, or at least it's transatlantic. And you see that events, whether it's World War I, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, World War II, the Holocaust, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, the resurgence of Putin, the fate of democracy in the United States, for better or for worse, and the fate of democracy in Europe are intertwined. And what we're seeing and these currents, Trump is not a unique figure, and I'll come to Ukraine in a second. Trump is not a unique figure because you have others, whether it's Berlusconi in Italy, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary. I believe Putin is a Trump-esque figure. Many others in the transatlantic relationship who are would-be, wanna-be, successful or failed autocrats. And I think what we've seen is you can try to understand why is it that democracy moves in parallel on the two sides of the Atlantic. I want to get to Ukraine, so I won't elaborate a theory. You're going to have Larry Diamond, who's a member of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which I co-chair. We often talk about these issues. You can ask Professor Diamond why. But the most recent answer is that in the end, after the end of the Cold War, we did not consolidate. Let's not talk with Gorbachev dying. We don't have to talk about whether it was our fault, Russia's fault, or all of the Europe's fault, or all of the above. But we didn't consolidate the end of the Cold War into a successful war and peace. And what you've seen is, there's some danger that it may be happening in Poland, even as we speak. What we've seen is the rise again, perhaps because of the lack of an external enemy, of these autocratic regimes. And as my mother warned me before I went to Prague, I write about it in The Last Palace. And then I got there, and one of my first meetings was with Václav Havel, the great, and he warned me the same thing as my mother. The Russian bear is stirring. And that is a 300-year experiment in fluctuating autocracies in Russia. So a larger, history, the saying, the pavement reared right up and hit me in the face. History is rearing right up. And that has given us Ukraine. Putin is testing, much like Donald Trump is testing the American system. Putin is testing our transatlantic and international resolve. And that too, in its own way, is a test of the American system. And I think Putin saw how Trump used Ukraine as a football, and he got away with it. And I think that emboldened him to act and to test Biden. And Biden has met the test.
But why wouldn't he have done the invasion when Trump was president? If he thought that Trump would likely give him a pass, why didn't he do it earlier? Why wait till Biden's in office?
He had everything he wanted with Donald Trump as president. He wanted a weak America. He got that. He wanted American division in NATO. He got that.
But it would have been better in terms of NATO, Ambassador. Things were much dicier between the U.S. and NATO, of course, when Trump was president. Why wouldn't that have been the time to leverage that discord within NATO?
Putin had the strong hand when Trump was president. You can see it, Larry, if you look at the Helsinki. If you see Putin's grin like he's eating the canary, Putin needs a certain amount of destabilization and weakening. Look, he hasn't attacked all of Europe. When Donald Trump went, he says, okay, how do I get my destabilization? I'm going to attack Ukraine. He did not. I think it was a miscalculation by Putin. I think he believed that Trump had sufficiently weakened the alliance that that the Europeans would not stand behind Biden's resolve. But boy, has he been wrong so far. So far.
All right, and clearly this has unified NATO to this point, but we're heading into the winter, and you've got this reliance in Western Europe on natural gas and fossil fuel from Russia. How long is that resolve going to be able to last?
Well, that is the question. And that, it is very frightening when you look at this 100-year history, now 100-year plus. I wrote this book, The Last Palace, to commemorate the 100-year as I mark it, the 100-year alliance between the two countries, as marked from 1918. I argue about why in the book. It seems to me that as you look at this history, there are times when democracy rises to the occasion, and there are times when it takes its eye off the ball. Churchill said it best for me. Of course, I admire him deeply. When I decided that I was going to have to fight Donald Trump for our democracy, I brought hundreds of cases against him before I did the impeachment, and I've continued to litigate against him. I just filed an amicus brief in this special master dispute last night. I'm representing a very senior group of Republicans who approached me to represent them on this brief.
Against the
special master. Yeah,
position.
against the creation of the special master. So I'm litigating still against Trump. I got Churchill's magisterial, I think it's a 5-volume history of World War II, and I read that as my guide to waging a sustained battle for democracy. Churchill said it best. I'm paraphrasing. You could choose between disgrace and defeat, and now you shall have both in Czechoslovakia, with the behavior of the appeasement. And I think we face that choice with Ukraine, and I hope we will stay the course. I do feel very good about American resolve for the moment. On the other hand, we're not as reliant as the Europeans are on Russian energy sources.
I also wanted to ask you, going back to Trump investigations, there's this Georgia state investigation about the president allegedly trying to get fraudulent votes that would turn the election in his favor in Georgia, and he'd take those electoral votes. To what extent is the president vulnerable in that investigation? Of course, allies of the president have already testified before the grand jury.
I think highly vulnerable. I think this year will bring progress on that front as well. I was early. I think I was actually the first in the country to do a major analysis of the Georgia investigation. I published it at the Brookings Institution. You can find it, the Fulton County investigation, Fulton County, Georgia investigation of Donald Trump, in which I assessed more than a year ago. Some of my colleagues were so incredulous behind the scenes at CNN when I said this, and I went on air and said it, that there were Trump and his circle were at substantial risk of prosecution by Fani Willis. Now we see that's coming to pass. Nobody can mistake the signs that she is closing in on the former president. She may not charge him. Merrick Garland may not charge for these document theft, mishandling, and obstruction crimes. Over 30 years, I really started doing law work at ADL on keeping track of some of our ADL cases. That was in 1985. So, I'm I'll be approaching almost 40 years. And then, of course, I went to law school, and I did it as a lawyer, of studying the law and working in the law and actively practicing the law. It's taught me, Larry, it's very perilous to make predictions about what prosecutors, courts, judges, and juries, and appellate courts, and the United States Supreme Court will do.
Or voters.
It's very hard to do. And voters, hardest of all.
Yeah.
That's not my discipline. That's not my discipline. I only do courts.
Let's take some questions from some of our viewers this evening. Peter asks, why do you think former President Trump kept those top secret documents?
I think that No one knows the answer, first of all. No one knows the answer. I believe that a big part of the reason he did it is because he has come to the conclusion that he is completely impervious and immune to consequences. So many, it's like the wonderful scene in Pulp Fiction, spoiler alert, where John Travolta and Samuel Jackson are simultaneously fired upon at close range by multiple individuals with handguns, and all the bullets miss them. And they look behind, and they've every bullet, dozens of bullets have missed them. And it leads to a religious epiphany for Samuel Jackson, which runs through the movie. Donald Trump believes he's invulnerable to consequences. So
But
I
that's
think
not a
there's an
motive.
arrogance.
No,
there's an arrogance. Yes, but I'm just starting. There's an arrogance and impunity that is the context. And then within that, he says, well, I want them, they're mine. We know he couldn't distinguish between what was his and what was America's, right? That was some of my litigation, emoluments, that he was taking constitutionally forbidden funds that people were giving him because he was president, including from foreign governments. I mean, it's unbelievable. They specifically went to his hotel to give him money through buying hotel ballrooms and events and things, renting. So, you know, he wanted them, and they were very interesting to him. Number three, I'm sure we know, for example, that one of the documents is possible dirt on the French president. I'm sure he viewed this as, oh, this is my ammunition. You know, if I ever want to get even, I've got this. Number four, I think there's probably materials in there that would be useful to him if he were to run again. For example, materials relating to the Russia investigation where he could reveal or rebut. There may be Biden-related materials in there. You know, he has this false obsession that Joe Biden and the Clintons and others. So it may be an opposition dossier. You know, maybe when the current president was in private life or a family member, something was picked up on a surveillance mic. So dirt. So those are, by my count, those are about five of the reasons. Larry, nobody knows. All we know is there's strong evidence of abuse that rises to the level of document crimes and of a second area of crime, obstruction.
It just would be helpful to know the motive, because one would think rationally that if you've given over documents to the FBI and you're keeping others you don't want to give over, and there's a chance that someone within your sphere is going to disclose to the FBI that these additional documents have been kept, I would think you would move those off premises to the place from which you gave them before. If the intent was really that the documents are so valuable to the former president, I would think the last thing he would do would be leave them at Mar-a-Lago.
Well, there's a lot of things this ex-president does that just defy rationality. I'll give you a psychiatric explanation. I'm not qualified, of course, but I'll quote psychiatrist friends of mine, that there's actually a deep self-destructive criminal impulse. There's an impulse, for whatever twisted reasons, to constantly push the boundaries of the law further and further and further until he's caught. And then to have a fight over whether or not he's done wrong, to triumph, grandiose ideation, to triumph over the law and to prove that he's greater than the law and he's invulnerable and immune and all powerful. Honestly, it defies logic and reason. But let me ask you, why would he continue to harp on this election that he claims he won when it's clearly undermining? He would be a much more viable candidate if he had simply said, okay, I lost, I have my issues with the count, I'm coming back in 4 years because Joe Biden is flushing this country down the toilet. If he were running on the substance, he would actually be a viable contender.
It's not
making
even
himself
himself.
marginal.
He's not only damaging himself, though, Ambassador. Look at all the harm that he's doing for Republican interests in these elections because of the candidates that he backs and the narrative that he continues to push. So he continues to do things that are not only self-defeating politically, because, there are so many things he did in the election, which he sabotaged himself against Biden, and now he's doing it against his own party's efforts, even in the midterm. So go figure.
Well, that's easy to explain psychiatrically, because, I think he's a sociopath or worse. And the only thing he cares about is Trump. And he may be shrewd enough at some deep reptilian brainstem level to understand, like Samson, that he's not going to survive, so he's going to bring down the temple. Okay, what he's doing at least has to have the sociopathic rationality should have of self-benefit. Instead, but there's a huge literature of this, and we've all seen it. We've seen it with people in our lives. He's doing harm to himself, but you're right, he's hurting a lot of other people, and he's hurting our country as well.
Let me ask another question. This is from Jim, who's watching tonight. Senator Graham predicts violence if the former president is prosecuted. What do you think?
I think that Senator Graham's predictions were reckless, and whether he did it intentionally or recklessly, he actually encouraged that violence. It's in the nature of, when Trump said, "Proud Boys, stand back and stand by," and they tweeted, Terrio, their leader, tweeted back, "Message received, sir. Standing by." I'm paraphrasing. And we saw the violence of January 6th that they ultimately led when Trump tweeted, "Will be wild. Come to Washington on January 6th, quote, will be wild." When many of his other ploys had failed, he sent out that tweet. I think it was extremely ill-considered. Now, Senator Graham has gone on TV and said, "Well, that's not what I meant." But in saying that it's not what he meant, he repeated it all over again. So I think he's diverged from the Lindsey Graham that many of us thought we knew. Look, I was a Joe Lieberman protege. I sat next to him in shul and on every Shabbos, and on breaks from the davening or the laning, the Torah reading or the prayers, we would talk about politics, and he schooled me for years. He explained Washington to me. So in Lieberman world, to me, Lindsey Graham, John McCain were icons of another party. And I used to deeply respect Lindsey Graham, but no more. I mean, I don't recognize that man anymore, Larry.
Setting aside the fact that he said this, do you think that it's an accurate statement? Do you think we are apt to see violence if the president ends up being charged?
I think there's a risk of violence. I think we need to be ready for it. I don't believe that we're going to see, massive uprising type of situations if there are charges. There could be isolated incidents, and I think we saw that with the search warrant. There was a deluded Trump supporter who tried to storm the FBI in the Midwest, an FBI office in the Midwest, and he brought a nail gun because he thought the nail gun would deal with the bulletproof glass. And ultimately, he was killed in the attempt. Certainly, we see many, many threats. I get them all the time. After I filed this brief yesterday. It's become a regular part of my life. And so I think that, I think we will see an enhanced threat level, but I think the country, as long as we're talking about it, and that's why this is so good. That's why I wanted to come back and talk to all of you
so
again.
You feel like we can meet this challenge.
Sensitive. My larger theme is that that the American people have united for democracy and justice, that we had a great threat to our democracy in 2020. We united, there was a referendum. We met the challenge. Ukraine, we had a threat abroad. We met the challenge. And now as a nation, we're meeting the challenge of an ex-president who is an autocrat and who has followers who don't accept the fundamental premises of American democracy.
Ambassador, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And we're meeting that, I believe we're meeting that challenge. The final chapter has yet to be written. There will be no final chapter because, as we say in Hebrew, Ein Sof Ladrishato. There's no end to this story of the fight for democracy. History teaches us that.
We have Jill, who asks, please talk about the Emoluments case you mentioned earlier that you were at the center of. Is that over?
The Emoluments case was the original sin of the Trump administration. This was the original sin of the Trump administration. That President Trump, and your guest tonight, I may have mentioned this to all of you on one of my previous visits. Your guest tonight is not a never Trumper or a member of the Trump derangement syndrome therapy group or anti-Donald Trump. I volunteered to work on his transition. I made that offer to both of the presidential candidates in 2016 to help him figure out why his blind trust, he said he was going to put his properties in a blind trust, but it wasn't a blind trust because he had someone known to him running them and he knew what was in the trust. It was the opposite of a blind trust. That was the original sin. Now, I left the transition when it was clear that he was not going to do the right thing, or I stopped advising them. They would tell you they threw me out, which is also fine. The truth is that the reasonable people led by Chris Christie rotated out and they stopped calling. When it became clear to me that Donald Trump was going to hang on to his properties, I saw that we had a constitutional problem because of my work with President Obama. I was one of the few people in the country who had studied the only ethics rule that was so important that the founders and framers of the Constitution put it in the text. You can't take money. If you're a president, you can't take money from a foreign government or anything of value without the express permission of Congress. And we call those gifts or things of value emoluments. It's just an 18th century term for cash or swag. And of course, by keeping his properties and putting his sons and Alan Weisselberg, who's now pled guilty to a bunch of crimes, his CFO, by putting them in charge of the trust and knowing what his properties were, that meant Donald Trump could get benefit, and foreign governments rushed to give him those benefits. Now, I sued him over and over again for this, and I actually had success, but it was very slow moving. And we hadn't gotten yet to trial in either of the two cases. There were actually more than two because there was an administrative matter as well, but we hadn't got to trial. Then when he left the presidency, they became moot and the Supreme Court threw the cases out.
All right, so there's no more to those. Kay Singh asks, what do you think is the likelihood that the judge will appoint a special master in the Justice Department investigation?
Well, the judge has said that she's preliminarily inclined, that's a quote, that she's preliminarily inclined to appoint a special master. So there is some likelihood that she will do it. I do not think, in this brief that I filed, DOJ has explained it, it doesn't make sense. Special masters are for attorney-client privilege disputes where the government takes some documents that clearly belong to an attorney and their client's issues, or to a client and the issues, the secret attorney-client privilege may be disclosed. That makes no sense when you have the executive branch it's reclaiming its own documents. It just, there's no special master case that has ever ruled for executive privilege. You have a special master. It conceptually makes no sense. That was the thrust of the brief we filed last night.
Well, I thought, though, that the Justice Department vetted the documents and found, in fact, that there were some of the documents in which attorney-client privilege would apply, and that those then would not be provided to investigators as a result.
Trump's papers are not about, there's a handful of attorney-client documents. They actually could be very important for other reasons, which I'm happy to talk about. But there's a filter team in place. The usual way DOJ does this is it has a separate set of people on the attorney-client documents. This fight is not about those documents. If the special master were just for the attorney-client documents, we probably would not be having this fight. It could be worked out. This fight is about the executive privilege documents. And Larry, I challenge you to find anywhere, Donald Trump filed 2 motions. He doesn't talk in those papers about attorney-client. He talks about executive privilege. Now, I'm not all the way through his filing that arrived 60 seconds before we started talking. Maybe he does it there.
But you're saying that has no bearing whatsoever. That has no relationship with a special master.
No.
The executive
None.
Authority. Okay.
None whatsoever. Just there's no such thing.
Judith asked, do you think that racism and Christian nationalism play a significant role in support for the former president?
No doubt. Now, I will tell you, I took a quick look at this new motion, and they are asking for relief on the attorney-client documents. Now, that's a different question. You can have a special master. They want both, attorney-client and executive. You can have a special master. There's cases where one is appointed. There's cases where one is denied. You can debate on the attorney-client, but you can't raise it for the first time in your reply brief. Right, this is the 3rd brief they've filed. What
is the potential harm of a special master? Why did you file a brief against that? Well, how does that hurt an investigation?
Because it will slow down the investigation and it will endanger American lives. If all these documents have to go to a special master who's going to review them, you can't have the intelligence community ongoing review of what might have gotten out. You need to let the intelligence community review these documents to determine, to do a threat assessment. And I believe we need to move expeditiously to making a prosecution decision, and it will slow that down too. On the role of racism, nationalism, ethno-nationalism, religion, Trump is shamelessly exploiting these violent sentiments that are a part of the body politic in every democracy. Because in a our democracy is a constitutional republic that is founded upon the popular will of the American people as expressed democratically at the ballot box. Because of that democratic foundation, we call ourselves a democracy. Democracies are uniquely vulnerable because they are so responsive to the popular will, uniquely vulnerable. For example, in our House of Representatives, there's a crazy caucus somewhere, 9, 12. There's a much larger anti-democratic caucus that voted, for example, to reject legitimate electoral slates from some states in the 2020 election. But the crazy caucus is a smaller group. Democracy is always going to throw off those individuals. Some of them genuinely believe the racism. Some of them are cynically exploiting it or giving in to their lesser angels. I don't think Donald Trump invented this problem in American democracy. It's fluctuated from our very beginning. Racism in the form of enslavement is part of our history. We know that and we still struggle with the consequences. But what Donald Trump did was he reaped the whirlwind, and many of the people that he has helped delude, and there's other causes, social media, the Fox News, there's many other reasons, dislocation, economic dislocation, drug abuse in America that has devastated and hollowed out lives. There's a lot of causes for this angst. But some of these Trump voters are people who voted for Obama. I met many of them. I went door to door.
Well, and honestly, don't you
country.
think some of this falls on the Democratic Party and the significant errors that they have made, and that they have in part driven people from the party, that is also part of this, not just the Trump attraction, but errors made by Democratic elected officials.
Nobody's perfect, and everybody who's alive, not just Democratic elected officials, makes mistakes. But I think there's an asymmetrical dysfunction, Larry, and that it's really been much worse on the other side of the aisle. The political scientists.
But that's sort of a separate issue. The issue is, so what are the factors that have driven the rise of Trump? And you appropriately point out all these issues of racism and Christian nationalism, other. But there are also things that Democrats have done that have given many working class Americans the view that the party doesn't represent them, and that you have to see that as part of the problem, right?
I certainly think, in retrospect, that the Clinton administration erred in the nature of the untrammeled and unchecked free trade. It lifted global standard of living. It reduced poverty globally. It helped the elites. It hammered many of our American industrial base communities. And so I would do, if I had the Clinton trade policies to do over again, I would do them very differently. There's a series of good faith. I don't think the difference, the reason I'm resisting you, Larry, is not because I'm reluctant to criticize the Democrats. My life is in danger every time I walk down K Street in DC, not from Trump supporters, from the Democratic special interests and Democratic lobbyists who I've fought for my entire career for the sake of sound policy. Sometimes it's pro-worker, sometimes it's pro-business, sometimes it's both. So we have plenty of special interests. I barred them from the White House. I persuaded Obama, put in these very tough lobbying restrictions. When I went to Prague after 2 years, the dean of the Democratic lobbies, I'm actually friendly with him, Tony Podesta, said, "This is the greatest win that the lobbying community has had in 2 years that Eisen is leaving." So yes, there's plenty wrong on both sides of the aisle. I call it out, but I think it's asymmetrical. It's in much more bad faith on the other side of the aisle.
All right, let's conclude. I want to go back to what you said earlier, because you expressed a degree of hopefulness about the country being able to withstand challenges to our democracy going forward. American democracy to this point is held despite these challenges. And what leads you to believe going forward, particularly with more people, in races who are election deniers, people who call into question results of elections without any evidence that there's been fraud that's been committed? So what gives you a counterbalance against these other anti-democratic forces, the view that we will prevail with a democracy?
Because we did in 2020. You had a president who was in the Oval Office with all the trappings of presidential power, plus command of the party apparatus, and the judges who he had appointed, federal and state legislators. He could not bend them to his will. The American people rose up in that election. It was a referendum. They chose democracy. So it's the lived experience of 2020. But it's not just that. I think if you look at American history, it acquits the 19th century clergyman's dictum that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I believe in American history, and then I'll give you one last reason.
Real briefly, yes.
I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor, and I returned. My mother loved to say to people, a Czech Holocaust survivor, that I returned to the country. They took her out on cattle cars. I returned on Air Force One to represent our country in Prague and to live in the house that was Wehrmacht headquarters. I made it kosher and lit the Sabbath candles. So I'm a hopeful person. I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. It's a bias, but it's a bias rooted in evidence of America in 2020, evidence of American history, and my life experience.
Ambassador Norman Eisen, great to talk with you this evening. Thanks so much, and I look forward to conversations in the future.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks,
Appreciate
David, Janice, Mel, Zev, and to all 3,000 of you
I
all
want
over
to just
the country.
I just want to invite you to join us next week, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. Former Solicitor General of the United States, now MSNBC contributor Neil Katyal will be in conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post investigative reporter Carol Leonig on the topic of the future of our democracy, what's at risk. And the LA Times' Pat Morrison, my good friend for so many years, will be leading that conversation. That's next Wednesday, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern time. And I also want to remind you that these programs are put on by two important nonprofit organizations, Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. You can visit the websites of either of these nonprofit organizations that pool their resources to put on these weekly programs. Please support them so that they continue to come our way each week, that they are free and available to everybody around the world. Until next Wednesday, have a wonderful rest of the week.